All right. Everybody squared away? Got what you need? Good deal. So the focus of the first 18 chapters of Exodus is on the deliverance of Israel from Egyptian bondage. In these chapters, the Exodus is projected through Moses, chapters 1 through 4, obstructed by Pharaoh, chapters 5 through 11, and effected by the Lord, chapters 12 through 18. The first 4 chapters speak of the situation which necessitated the Exodus, as well as the anticipation of that event. 3 pictures of God in these chapters drive home the point that God was aware of the suffering of his people and was working behind the scenes to prepare for their deliverance. And so that is where we begin tonight, the persecution of God's people. A new generation, verses 1 through 7 of Exodus chapter 1. These are some of the quickest verses we're ever going to read right here. Verses 2, 3, 4, and 5 are pretty quick. Now, these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. They came, each one with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. And all the persons who came from the loins of Jacob were 70 in number, but Joseph was already in Egypt. And Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. But the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly, and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. So, we have here a brief statement of the current situation, which is actually a continuation of what we find that happened in the book in Genesis. In fact, this goes back all the way to Genesis chapter 15. Now, was Joseph alive or Jacob or any of his sons alive in Genesis chapter 15? Yeah, who are we dealing with in chapter 15? Another Old Testament patriarch is Abraham. And so this is actually predicted, Genesis chapter 15 verses 13 to 16. It says this: "And God said to Abram, know for certain, that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. But I will judge the nation whom they serve, and afterward they will come out with many possessions. And as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age. Then in the 4th generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete." So Exodus 1 is actually a sequel to Genesis. Books of the Bible that follow one another, are they always sequels? Oh, certainly not. But in this case, it is. It's a sequel. And so this chapter, the chapter 1, is carefully connected with what precedes by means of a threefold recapitulation. So the name of Jacob's children. Now, if you go back to verse 1, it says this. Now these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. Are they the sons of Israel or sons of Jacob? Same. What do you mean? Yeah. Jacob and Israel were the same person, right? Right? So, how'd that happen? What went on with Jacob that he ended up with a name like Israel? Yeah. It's when he wrestled, right? Yeah. Was it his hip that was displaced? Which that felt good. You can call me whatever you want to call me. Just put my hip back right. Right? So Israel, Jacob's name is Israel. And so there it's a recapitulation here that the name of Jacob's children, or the sons of Israel, same thing. That's a callback to Genesis 35. The number of Jacob's descendants who went down into Egypt, that's a callback to Genesis 46. And then again, the death of Joseph, which is a very important event in this whole thing, we find in Genesis chapter 50. So we do have a continuation, very much a sequel from Genesis to Exodus, and a recapitulation of some very important events. Now, according to verse 6, Joseph's brothers also died in Egypt. You know, when we talk about the tribes and stuff, their names that are associated with those tribes, you know, you kind of think that maybe they got to enjoy quite a bit, you know, with the tribe of Benjamin and the tribe of this and that and the other. But pretty much what happened to all of them? They died what? Well, they died in Egypt. Now, might they have been in bondage at the time? We're not sure about the exact time frame as that when it occurred, because the bondage didn't occur until what? Till after Joseph died, and then another king. We're going to talk about that. Now, Genesis ended with the death of Joseph, and Exodus begins 300 years later with the birth of Moses. Now, for some time after Joseph's death, the Israelites multiplied phenomenally in accordance with God's promise to Abraham. With God's promise to Abraham. And so that is a new generation that is taking place here in Exodus. Quite a bit of time has passed, and there are quite a few people, which we're going to see, according to some, that they think how many people were actually taking part in this. So we have a new king. Now, if you recall, the timeline of all this varies, right? You remember that when we talked about last week? We said there's two main theories. Late theory and the early theory. And we, according to that, now if you look at those of you that weren't here, because we did have a number of folks that weren't here, if you look on the timeline from lesson 1, you'll see that we are leaning on the early or the late. The early. And so that meant that a cherished tradition was rendered historically incorrect. What's that? Yeah, the movie Ten Commandments, right? Because the Pharaoh, which they say in the Ten Commandments that was during the time of the Exodus itself was Ramses, which, as you see on the chart there, if you take some time to look into that, that's in accordance with the late theory, that it happened quite a bit later in history. And so we are going to look at this from the early period. And so a new dynasty then, which we believe is the one that was coming to power at the time of Moses' birth, was a new dynasty that was the 18th, arose in Egypt. And in Acts chapter 7, now in our Sunday school class that Pastor Danny teaches, we camped out in this chapter, Acts chapter 7, for a good number of weeks. Yeah. And so, yeah. And what it was a recapitulation. It was a retelling of some of the major events out of Genesis and Exodus and so forth and so on. Basically, the history of Israel. And some of these things are directly spoken about. And some we find out some extra details actually from things in Acts and also in Hebrews. And so here we find out in Acts 7:17 and 18, but as the time of the promise was approaching, which God had assured to Abraham, the people increased and multiplied in Egypt until there arose another king over Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph. So we believe this was the 18th dynasty according to your charts. The 18th dynasty. So this dynasty inaugurated a new policy towards the Israelites, having just driven the Hyksos. How would you pronounce that? Hyksos. Anybody going to help me with that? Hyksos sounds good, but I don't want to get some of you going here that are from down below south of the river there. That's what you put on fried possum, Hyksos. All right, so that's Tennessee. I just said south of the river. So, yeah. Did y'all know the toothbrush was invented in Kentucky? You heard this one? The toothbrush was, because if it was invented anywhere else, it'd be called a teeth brush. All right. So So having just driven these folks from the land, the kings were specifically sensitive to the possibility that some other foreign adversary might attempt to push into Egypt. So things have happened within their history that's made them gun shy to some possible things happening. Now, this is consistent with individuals? This is consistent with nations? Something bad happens, and then we tend to what? You react and overreact to it, and then having experienced said bad thing, you tend to kind of what? You protect against that, maybe more so than someone else who hasn't experienced it. You know what I'm talking about? You tend to put up you fortify defenses so that that'll never happen again. And so you either react, sometimes overreact, but definitely things they color how we approach things, and that happens individually and it happens with nations. And so they were afraid of going through another situation. So these kings were especially sensitive to the possibility that some other foreign adversary might attempt to push into Egypt. Now, if this other foreign adversary was pushing into Egypt, they could attempt to do something. And so what were these Egyptian leaders afraid of? They might ally, they might cause the Israelites to raise up with them against their oppressors, or against not their oppressors, but the people in the land. They might get greedy. Egypt, where they have any money? Yeah, they were a wealthy nation, right? So maybe they were afraid of losing what they had, so they wanted to protect it, and so they took some steps. So they feared that the Semitic Israelites might aid any invader from the north. Exodus 1 vividly portrays the struggle between one king who would destroy God's people through various programs and the heavenly king who was determined to preserve them. And so that's really what we need to see here. We always need to keep the backdrop of understanding God's providence and sovereignty, because God's providence and His sovereignty and what He has promised and declared, it comes into great play here. So we know the fact that they are in Egypt was according to one of God's promises, right? What did we just read in Genesis 15? And not only that they were there, but things were going to happen while they were there. They would become slaves and in bondage. So, in spite of every effort to thwart them, the Israelites continued to increase. Taskmasters were appointed to supervise forced labor. See, this is all in reaction to what happened with this other situation, and so now they're taking steps to prevent that. The Israelites were required to build the store cities of Pithom and Ramses. In spite of the vigorous labor, the Israelites continued to multiply. Now, here's where this is one of the theories as to the number of people that were alive at the time of the Exodus. So, at the time of the Exodus, there were 600,000 men above age 20. Okay, 600,000 men above age 20. Now, that is taken from Numbers 146, which is, why would they be counting men age 20 and over in the book of Numbers? Yeah, this is who are going to be able to fight. They're military. Which would total about, besides women and children and everybody else, children then would be fellers 19 and younger, and ladies, all that, which would total about, they estimate, 3 million Israelites. For 70 persons to grow to this number in 430 years. Is this mathematically possible? Well, even without God, I mean, it's possible. I mean, yes, we know. Well, okay, you bring up a good point. What do you mean with God? Okay, so this is what I want us to make sure. Okay, this is setting up a good discussion that we need to have about this entire book. God's providence. So, are we saying then that the population was a result of God's intervention? Okay, well, we understand that. Well, is God somehow causing more children to, is that? We're through birth? Okay. Well, what I'm saying is that as a natural, are we saying that God miraculously intervened here to cause more babies? Here's where I want to make sure that we're careful in the way that we speak about God working here throughout this whole book. Okay, because what do we need to be careful of? Or do we? Okay, that's extremely important. Yeah, so at any point here are we compromising man's free will? Are we saying that God maybe caused them to have more desire for one another so they would multiply more? Are we saying that? Does that remove? You see what I'm saying? We need to be careful what we attribute to God and what the Scripture tells us than when we make assumptions. So it is possible that God was involved in this multiplication, but was it necessary for God to be involved in it? Just from a math speaking, just regular population statistics. Okay? For 70 persons to grow to this number in 430 years, they would have to double about every 25 years, which is entirely possible. Yeah. Especially. Yeah, absolutely. Paul? I'm sorry, when did what? When you say they, what do you mean they? Okay. Well, it starts out that way, but then later on we find that God permitted certain things because of the hardness of man's hearts. And so I don't know that we could ever say, you'd have to look from a cultural perspective of when that took place. But as far as what we know that was happening with the Israelites, I don't think we have any evidence of, that I know of multiple wives being the case here. So if we just assume regular population statistics, doubling once every 25 years, you can get to 3 million easily. So that is when we talk about a new king and what was taking place. So we have a number of people, right? And they are afraid, the Egyptian government, of losing control of said people, so they take away their freedom. And so we end up now with a new strategy. And this is where we see the oppression increases. Now, verses 8 through 14, did not read those. Let's go ahead and, I wanted to read those, and I just blew right on back. So verse 8 says, Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and in the event of war, they also join themselves to those who hate us, and fight against us and depart from the land. So we summed this up. So they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor, and they built for Pharaoh stored cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that they were in dread of the sons of Israel. Let's just keep right on going here. And the Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously, and they made their lives bitter with hard labor, and in mortar and bricks, and at all kinds of labor in the field, all their labors which they rigorously imposed on them. Verse 15, Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives. Okay, so they started with the hard labor, and now we're going to see some things happening here. And this is going to lead to, I think, some very interesting discussion. So then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah, and the other was named Puah, which is funny. That's the name of a character in the Moana, so that's not the same one, obviously. And he said, when you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death, but if it is a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had commanded them, but let the boys leave. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing, and let the boys live? And the midwives said to the Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous, and they give birth before the midwife can get to them. So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty. And it came about, because the midwives feared God, that he established households for them. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. So, a new strategy. The oppression increases. In the second phase of the persecution, the forced labor intensified. The Egyptians worked the Israelites ruthlessly. Not only were they engaged in hard labor in bricks and mortar, but also in the fields. Now, Josephus, this is interesting, indicates that they were forced to dig canals. Okay, just so everybody knows, Josephus, are we all up on who Josephus is? He's a Jewish historian, 1st or 2nd century historian. So this is his take here on what was happening. So Josephus indicates that they were forced to dig canals, and Deuteronomy 11:10 alludes to work on irrigation projects, which would seem very consistent. So the first phase was hard labor, and then even more hard labor. In the third phase of the Egyptian persecution, the Egyptians resorted to population control. 2 chief Hebrew midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, were ordered by Pharaoh to kill all male infants at the birth stool. Now, ladies, you can be thankful for what you have today. The birth stools were nothing more than 2 stones over which the woman would crouch at the time of birth. That doesn't sound very pleasant, right? So, now here's something I want to ask you. These 2 godly women could not bring themselves to commit infanticide. When Pharaoh called them to account, they excused themselves by pointing to the vigor of the Hebrew women in childbirth. All right, look here. I don't know about you, but the way I read that, the way that I understand as I read that, they lied. We have a problem here, don't we? God, later on it says that God blessed their families, and so the logical conclusion is that God blesses liars. Okay, so what do we have here? Okay, government versus God. Let's just talk from the midwife's perspective. Is it okay to do something wrong to do something right? One at a time. Here and then over here. Okay. All right. So explain what you're saying there. You're telling me what? Tell me what it, right. Okay. Okay. All right. So you are restating what we understand. My question is it okay to do something sinful, wrong, in order to do something good? Someone over here. So lying is not contrary. Lying is in accordance with God's will? Okay, so their explanation was Well, they have the baby before we can get there. Okay, now let's be honest. Let's be honest. Was that every situation? Okay, so, all right. So the question is it okay to do something wrong to do something right? Paul? Say it again. Rahab? Okay. So we have another account of this. Doing something wrong to do something good. I thought I saw a hand over here. Okay. Okay. Go ahead. Okay. All right, so I've seen a story of a lady that basically smuggled children out during that time. And in order to do that, she had to deceive and lie the whole time. Okay, so are you fully, are you riled up yet? I hope you're not. Okay, here's what it boils down to. And I think this is biblical, all right? And hopefully you'll be all right when we're done with this. I say, and this is my opinion, you can go throw it in the river with the hick sauce if you want, but I believe it is biblical to choose the greater good. No, you can't say that. You can't say God's law first because lying is against God's law. Okay, and so in this case, you have follow Pharaoh and do what he says, kill a baby, commit infanticide, or lie. Well, when we talk about it like that, it's what? It's a no-brainer. Right? It's a no-brainer. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Certainly. And so what we see here is we have the concept of the greater good, and we understand that ultimately we're considering that in these cases, and I think there's other things we can talk about, that God deals with those situations justly. God understands those things. If you are deceiving evil Pharaoh in order to protect precious life, then God's justice kicks in at that point and realizes, I think he's understanding of said situations. Anybody disagree with that? Anybody have a different view on this? Now, I think we have evidence here that God blessed them. It says that God blessed them. Now, this dynamic only exists what we would truly call a moral dilemma. You cannot just apply this loosely in any other circumstance. It has to be something that is just very specific to something like this. You know, government says I do this. In order to do something that is the greater good, I must lie and deceive. That's a very extreme circumstance. So what I'm saying here is not that anybody here would, but don't use this as a license to in any other kind of general circumstance. This is a very specific thing. Now, isn't this interesting that right off the bat here we have a discussion about morality and things such as this right off the bat here in the book of Exodus? I was excited when we came across this because I thought, wow, this is a great discussion because now here's another thing too. This is not situational ethics. Don't let anybody try to tell you this is situational ethics. Why is this not situational ethics? You guys know what I mean when I say situational ethics? That the situation determines what is right and what is wrong? Why is this not that? Go ahead, Kayla. Right. There's still an objective source. There's still an objective source of right and wrong that determines. We're still saying that God's justice comes into play here. We're not determining right or wrong based on the circumstance for our own selves. Anybody else want to add to what Kayla said? Okay. So, when Pharaoh called them to account, they excused themselves by pointing to the vigor of the Hebrew women in childbirth. The children had already been born before the midwives could arrive. Perhaps there was some truth in what the midwives said, but it was not the whole truth. God blessed these two courageous midwives with families of their own, is what we find out. Meanwhile, the Israelites continued to increase in Egypt. So, the first three phases were labor, and then increasing the labor, and then basically population control now. Infanticide is what they're wanting to do. That didn't work, so now Pharaoh moves to the fourth phase of the persecution. He gave the order to throw the Israelite male infants into the Nile River. The Israelites themselves were subject to this order, and no doubt they were under a death sentence if they did not carry it out. So, if that is true, we need to keep that in mind about what we're going to read next. Because I really want us to think about this as we move forward here. So, we have established so far the persecution of God's people and what is taking place, and now we see the preparation of God's prophet. So Exodus begins the account of Moses. His life and work are the subject matter of not only the book of Exodus, but also Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Moses stands out as one of the greatest, perhaps the greatest man of the pre-Christian world. He took a race of salves, slaves, please correct that typo, salves, good grief, under inconceivably trying circumstances, molded them into a powerful nation that altered the whole course of history. Now, of course, we're not diminishing God's involvement here. We know that God is providentially working behind the scenes, sometimes very out in front, not just behind the scenes, to bring about His will. But Moses and his obedience and his leadership were at the forefront. He was a great man of history. Now, we have this section titled here, A Godly Home, which is an interesting title. So verses 1 through 10. Who wants to help me read? Let's hear someone else's dulcet tones. Verses 1 through 10. Yeah, Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 10. If you're there, Phil, would you do that for us? Okay. All right. So a godly home. So as the persecution against Israel intensified, so also did God's countermeasures. The Exodus is anticipated by the preparation of a leader through whom God would effect the deliverance of His people. In Exodus chapter 6, verse 20, we find out these two parents were named Amram and Jochebed. These were Moses' parents. And here's something interesting. Hebrews 11:23, by faith Moses, when he was born, was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child and they were not afraid of the king's edict. Now, let's just think about this for a moment. 3 months. It would be good to have Eric in here to talk about this. Many of you have had in your arms a little baby for 3 months. Now, on top of this, I want you to add the factor of not being found out. Would that be stressful? Is a 3-month-old baby stressful anyway? Do you think there was ever a moment in time when they could have been found out? Do you think there was ever an Egyptian official, maybe some sort of a I don't know what to call it, a military or police officer, some sort of enforcement that was near the home? Beth? Oh, yeah. Yeah, because what? He was a pretty baby. See, in this it says he was beautiful. Another place it says he was, let's talk about that, because did you catch this? I hope you caught this. Was hidden for 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child. That seems like a weird reason, doesn't it? I'm sorry, what? Well, why would that be a factor? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, let's all be honest. If it's your child, if it's ugly or pretty or whatever, that's your baby, you know. And what I mean, I think I maybe heard that first time Cora saw Danny, she's like, "Oh Lord," you know. But she kept up, you know. It all worked out. Wayne, you're laughing hard on that one. Yeah. That doesn't seem like a reason unless there's some sort of worldview that's behind this. Other women had done that? Well, we're actually going to find out. We're actually going to find out about this. Moses, on the next page, was born about 1525 BC. He was born of the tribe of Levi, we find out. Aaron, his brother, was 3 years older, and Miriam was older still. So Miriam was the oldest, then Aaron, then Moses. Now here's this. A beautiful and lovely child, they actually believed the beauty of the child was taken as a sign that God had something special in store for him. Well, there wasn't an edict in place at that time, but really they too played a huge role. I mean, Miriam and Aaron, but it's just interesting that this was used. That this is not only mentioned in Exodus, but it's mentioned in Hebrews about being a lovely or beautiful child, and that was the reason. Well, it wasn't just because they were vain. It's because they believed it was a sign from God. So this 3 months goes by, and they just can't do it any longer. 3 months goes by, they can't hide him no more. And so by faith, they committed him to the Nile River in a waterproof, and this is taken from Doc Smith's commentary, I like the word he uses here, ark, made of the sticky papyrus found along the Nile. His mother took 2 precautions. She placed the ark among the reeds near the bank where it could not be swept along with the current. So she strategically placed it so that it wouldn't go far. And she also stationed Miriam nearby to guard against any unexpected danger. Now, you could think of it like this. I know of a fellow one time that was fishing in a Florida lake with a buzzbait, and a pair of eyes started following that buzzbait, and so said feller left. Well, those pair of eyes was a gator. Now, what I'm saying is that when you're placing a child, a 3-month-old child, in a basket into a river with said wildlife all around, no telling what kind of living creatures. So Miriam was stationed nearby to keep an eye. And so we know that then Pharaoh's daughter finds the ark, this basket. God uses the tears of the infant to touch the heart of Pharaoh's daughter as she came down to the sacred Nile to take her ritual bath. Now this is interesting. She recognized him as a Hebrew, as he was abandoned, as he was an abandoned male. So there was a little bit of logic and reason. Maybe there was also, the baby had a certain look to it, ethnic, you might have been able to tell. Some have surmised that she was able to tell because the baby was circumcised. However, Egyptians, but you didn't know this, did the same thing. So that wouldn't have been a distinguishing mark for a Hebrew versus an Egyptian baby, because Egyptians circumcise as well. Could be. But she was moved, it says, by his what? His tears. He was crying. Miriam, who was hiding nearby. Now, you're Miriam. You've been watching this whole thing unfold. You see that the baby is now found by Pharaoh's daughter. What do you think you'd be feeling? Would you be happy? Yay! What would you be thinking? Because what does it say that Pharaoh's daughter immediately recognized what? It's a Hebrew. So what do you think? I mean, technically, if she did what she was supposed to do according to the king's edict, that, we take it away. So you can imagine, you think her heart was beating a little bit, Miriam? Can you imagine? Now, not only was she watching all this, at some point she made a decision to what? Somehow she joined in this discussion. They're all oohing and ahhing over this beautiful baby, and now Miriam decides to reveal herself. She doesn't say who she is or how she knows what's going on, but somehow she inserts herself into this situation. And so what unfolds here is really interesting. She was hiding nearby, stepped forward to secure a Hebrew nurse for the infant. Miriam brought Jochebed to the princess, who contracted with her to nurse the baby. Now, I want you to think about this. You talk about, now this is God's providence at work here through free will and stuff. So you step out in faith. You step out in faith, and you send, to do the baby, and it's picked up by Pharaoh's daughter, which that could go either way, but it ends up going good. And not only that, you're now going to get paid to nurse your own baby. It's ironic, yes. Yeah. That the mother would be paid by an Egyptian princess to nurse her own son is truly amazing, and it's quite ironic. I think it's both amazing and ironic. Lynn? Sure. I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. I wonder that myself. Would she place him in there? Was she hoping that Pharaoh's daughter would find him? I don't know. That's what I'm saying. There's a lot of factors. Was this strategic in the fact that at the time, at the place, were Jochebed and Miriam intentional here in hoping that Pharaoh's daughter would find a baby? Okay, so this is possible. I don't know that we know this, but I think it's within reason to say that they maybe were strategic as such. Certainly. Certainly. And so are we going to find out, or do we know that Pharaoh knew that this was a Hebrew baby? Maybe we'll find out. Well, we surmise that it was the fact that it was a male baby abandoned in the river. Or it could have also been the ethnicity, the skin tone, the facial features that sometimes can be to a certain people group. Maybe there were some other identifying factors as the type of wrapping clothes or anything like that. See, what's interesting, we're going to find out later in this chapter that, what time is it? Hopefully I can get there. Oh, holy smokes. Daggone it. Yeah, I should know better. Now, a special education here, Acts 7. Well, we did get started about 10 minutes late because of the papers and stuff, but that's my fault. I should have known with the food. All right, Acts 7:20 through 22, again in Acts. It was at this time that Moses was born, and he was lovely. Again, we see this in the sight of God. And he was nurtured 3 months in his father's home. And after he had been set outside, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and nurtured him as her own. Moses was educated in all the learning of the Egyptians, and he was a man of power in words and deeds. Raised in the palace as the adopted son of the princess, Moses was trained in the great Egyptian schools. Even today, scholars marvel at the learning of the Egyptians, and no doubt Moses stood at the head of his class. Yahweh was preparing this young man for what was to come. We're going to push through. A great failure. A great failure. Verses 11 through 15. Now it came about in those days when Moses had grown up that he went out to his brethren and looked at their hard labors, and he saw the Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that, and then he saw there was no one around. He struck down the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And he went out the next day, and behold, 2 Hebrews were fighting with each other, and he said to the offender, "Why are you striking your companion?" But he said, "Who made you a prince or a judge over us? Are you intending to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and said, "Surely the matter has become known." When the Pharaoh heard of the matter, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from the presence of Pharaoh and settled in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. So when Moses had reached maturity, he made the first in a series of faith decisions. Now this is interesting. He refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to suffer affliction with the people of God rather than enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season. Those people who cherished the messianic hope suffered a reproach. To Moses, however, that reproach was more valuable than all the treasures of Egypt. He knew that ultimately God would reward his faith. Now, that's a summation of the Hebrews 11 passage, 24 through 26. See, at age 40, Moses left the luxury of the palace to visit his countrymen. Seeing an Egyptian beating a fellow Hebrew, Moses was roused to anger. Now, checking to see that no one was watching, he slew the Egyptian and hid his body in the sand. Moses here was acting at the wrong time for the wrong motive, and he employed the wrong method. Moses' rash act was punished by his exile in the land of Midian for 40 years. His deeds come to the light the very next day. Pharaoh learned that Moses slew the Egyptian and tried to kill Moses. Therefore, Moses fled to Midian. And then we have here a long delay. A long delay. Moses' flight to Midian can be viewed as an act of faith in that he made no effort to defend himself or reconcile himself to Pharaoh. So, this is interesting. The fact that he fled to Midian is recounted in the book of Hebrews as an act of faith. That don't seem right, does it? Then at first glance, it's kind of like, what? You killed a man and you ran to avoid punishment, but that's said as an act of faith. In Hebrews 11 we call what? Faith Hall of Fame, right? So right in the middle of that, this is talking about an act of faith. Well, Hebrews 11:27 explains that by faith he left Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, not caring about his status and position. See, a lot of times when someone that's in power, that has wealth, that has riches and power and position, when they make a mistake, they tend to try to preserve themselves. Don't they? We don't see that happen in politics, do we? Just think about that for a minute. So rather than valuing those things, eventually it says that he valued what? God more than those things. Not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is unseen. And we understand that Moses' life is divided into 3 equal periods: 40 years as a prince in Egypt, 40 years as a shepherd in Midian, and 40 years as leader of Israel. The next 40 years he lived in Midian. 4 developments into Moses' life during this period are clear. Now, I want to share these verses with you. So at verse 16 it says, "Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. Then shepherds came out and drove them away, but Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. When they came to Reuel," how do we want to pronounce that? Anybody have a good pronunciation for this? Reuel? Let's just say Reuel. His other name's easier to say. So it would say Granny Clampett. Okay, when they came, you'll see why in a minute. All right, when they came to Reuel, their father, he said, "Why have you come back so soon today?" These are the daughters. So they said in Egyptian, wait a minute. In Egyptian? What's that? Okay, so when he was a baby, he was recognized as a, but now he's recognized as a, it's an interesting thing to think about. Certainly. An Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds, and what is more, he even drew the water for us and watered the flock. What's this tell us about Moses? He's a good guy, right? And he said to his daughters, "Where is he then? Why is it that you have left this man behind?" Dad's saying, "He sounds like a pretty good feller. What? Do something nice for him. You should invite him to dinner. Yeah, you need a husband. Invite him to have something to eat." And Moses was willing to dwell with the man, and he gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses. Then she gave birth to a son, and he named him Gershom, for he said, "I have been a sojourner in a foreign land." Now it came about in the course of those many days that the king of Egypt died, and the sons of Israel sighed because of the bondage, and they cried out, and their cry for help because of their bondage rose up to God. So God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And God saw the sons of Israel, and God took notice of them. So the next 40 years, he lived in Midian. 4 developments in his life are clear. Even after his leadership setback in Egypt, Moses was still willing to champion the cause of the weak as he helped these ladies. Another thing that we see is Moses lodged and stayed and spent time in a godly home. Reuel, friend of God, was a priest of Midian. Reuel is also called Jethro. I prefer to call him that. Now you see what I said, Granny Clampett. Okay, in 3:1. So we're going to call him Jethro, a name which appears to be a title meaning highness. So this was a title that was attributed to Reuel, who was a priest of Midian, highness. He seems to have been a worshiper of Yahweh. Jethro was impressed with Moses and invited him to live with him and manage his flocks. Moses agreed and spent the next 40 years in the camp of Jethro, and eventually married Zipporah, one of the daughters of Jethro. They had a son named Gershom, and it means basically a sojourner there. And it's talking about that Moses was a sojourner there, basically an alien in this place. He tended the flock and learned the discipline of the desert for 40 years. This is an important statement, this next one. We talk about God's providence. These 40 years in God's providence were part of Moses' training. The loneliness and roughness of the wilderness developed sturdy qualities he could hardly acquire in the softness of the palace. It familiarized him with the region in which he later led Israel for 40 years. God was preparing him. Now, did God cause Moses to end up in Midian? What did he use? He uses Moses' free will decision to bring about training and development of his person, which were going to be necessary traits. If Moses had gone straight from the palace to leading the people out, I don't think he would have been as effective as a leader as he would have been had he not spent these years basically training in the desert. All right, any questions or comments? Had we started on time, I've been done early. Pretty interesting stuff right off the bat, right? And it's going to get even better and better. So I appreciate your all's discussion and attention.